Hello, welcome to Alyssa Jean's Reviews, and welcome to the second video in my 2022 awards series, or alternatively, we can call it the best and worst of 2022. The playlist that you will find this on my homepage is called the best and worst of 2022. I have 4 videos planned. The first one was last week. That was the most overrated show of 2022. And this week, we are going to talk about the opposite of that. This is the most underrated show of 2022 as deemed by me and no one else. This is my opinion. Although I'm looking at underrated in a different way than I was looking at overrated. Overrated was the show that everyone else loved and I didn't think was that great. Underrated, or at least in this case, is more of a show that I just don't think anyone's ever heard of, or nobody watches, or nobody cares about. And then too, when people do watch it, they maybe don't love it as much as I do. But generally speaking, it's more that people just don't watch it, or just not familiar with it. In fact, so few people watched this particular show that I'm going to talk about that it freaking got canceled, which really made me sad that it got canceled after one season. So before I dive into it, just a quick review of what last year's 2021 most underrated show was. Another one that I just think people didn't watch, people didn't care about, people didn't talk about, and then those who did watch it didn't like it as much as I did. And so last year's, as a review, was Catla from Netflix. It was an Icelandic show. Now, it does start off very, very slow, and I think that probably turned a lot of people off. It can be very boring in the beginning, but the 6th and final episode to me was a masterpiece. It was a piece of art, and I loved it, but I'm kind of the only one who felt that way. So to me, very underrated. Now, let's go ahead and dive into this year's most underrated show. Also, as I said, one that I just don't think a lot of people watched or knew about or cared about. And so the most underrated show of 2022, let's bring in the drum roll, is The Time Traveler's Wife from HBO Max. So yeah, this was a part of HBO Max's canceling spree that they went on this year. They just canceling shows right and left. And it's unfortunate because this was only the first of 2 seasons that would have covered the entire book. So yes, this is based off of a novel, one that I absolutely love. It's one of my favorite books that I've ever read, ever. And they made a crappy movie out of this several years ago. It just wasn't very good. Didn't do the book any justice. But the show did a much better job of doing justice to the source material. I wish that they had decided to do a 12-episode single season, a limited series that would have covered the entire book. But now they decided to get all cutesy and split it up into half. And so they did a 6-episode season that only covers half the book. And now we won't see the rest of the book on screen. So that's very disappointing to me. But I loved it. I thought it was amazing, wonderful, fantastic, and all of these things. And it did do justice to the novel, which I absolutely adore. So let me go ahead now and kind of get into more details of why I loved this so much. Since most people probably haven't watched this show, I'm going to be mostly spoiler free. I mean, I'm not going to get into any of like the details of what happens in the story. But in order to kind of explain to you what this is about, I am going to have to be a little bit spoilery. There are certain major plot points I'm going to have to divulge, but personally, I don't think that spoils anything. Like, I think it's just telling you what the story is. But if you are interested in watching The Time Traveler's Wife and haven't yet, and you're very, very squeamish about spoilers, then maybe you don't watch this. But I think anyone else, I think you need to hear me like set the foundation and the basis for what the show is about, which, yes, does spoil some things slightly. So anyway, let me go ahead and start doing that, and I can explain to you why I love this show, and mainly why I loved the novel in which it was based on so very much. Okay, so there are two main reasons why I love the novel so much, and why I also loved the first season of, well, the only season of the show so much as well, because the show did such a great job of conveying both aspects of the novel that I really loved. So, number one is the time travel logic. As you can tell, it's about a time traveler. It's called The Time Traveler's Wife. Um, and if you are familiar with my channel at all, you know how much I love time travel and a specific type of time travel, which I'll get into in just a moment. The other aspect of the novel that the show did very well is the relationship between the two main characters. You can call it a love story, but I just think of it more as a relationship. I think that both the novel and the show do an excellent job of showing the complexities of a real life relationship and putting two lovers into a fantastical situation, and yet they behave exactly as how you would expect two people, especially these two particular characters, would behave in this fantastical situation. So it's very grounded in reality as far as the relationship aspect of it goes, even though it's within the context of a fantastical situation. So I think the show does this so well. And the novel, of course, is what it's based off of, does both of these things really well. So let me start with the time travel aspect of it all. So again, if you're familiar with my channel, I've talked about different types of time travel logic. I stick with the format that my brother uses, which there are three different types of time travel logic. Type 1 is the whatever happened type of time travel logic. So when you go back in time, no matter what you do, you cannot change anything. Whatever you do has just simply always happened. It's a very fatalistic point of view. Type 2 time travel logic is the most common one. That's the Back to the Future time travel logic. When you go back in time and you change something, you've changed the timeline. People can be wiped out of existence and that sort of thing, you know, or the entire history can change, that sort of thing. It's the one that Star Trek uses most often. And then there is Type 3, which was actually used by Star Trek 2009, the film, which is that when you go back and change something, you create a separate timeline. So the original timeline still exists, but the new timeline exists alongside it, and that's what happened in the Star Trek 2009 films, the J.J. Abrams Star Trek films. So the time traveler's wife uses type 1, whatever happened, happened. And if you know my channel, you know that this is my absolute favorite type of time travel logic. And the reason why I love it is because you can tell a time travel story with this type of time travel logic without having all these nonsensical paradoxes that ruin the story for me. Everything just can, if it's done well, will tie together perfectly, and everything connects. All the dots connect, and the dots can connect in an intricate web that is very complicated and makes your head hurt to try to sort through it all. But it all connects and it all makes sense. And this is the type of time travel logic that the Netflix show Dark used, and they did create an intricate web of time travel that made your head hurt to sort it all out, but it made sense. Whereas you have a lot of films that use the type 2 time travel logic, such as Looper, such as this year's Netflix movie, The Adam Project, starring Ryan Reynolds, where the time paradoxes become plot holes, and it bugs the crap out of me. With type 1, there are not plot holes if you're doing it correctly, because it all ties together. It can be all intricate and complicated, but it all makes sense. And that is exactly what Time Travel's Wife did in the novel. And then the show does an excellent job of portraying it on screen. I love how they adopted a lot of the time travel stuff from the novel into the show. So the show and the novel, this is where I might get a little tiny spoilery for people who are, very squeamish, but it follows a man named Henry who has this rare genetic disorder that causes him to just spontaneously travel back into time. So when that happens, he disappears. He always goes naked, so his clothes are still on the ground, and he just disappears, and he is always traveling within his own lifetime, usually most often into his past, occasionally into his future, but more often than not into his own past. His time travel is guided by his own inner self. So like a really big event, a really big traumatic event in his life, he will continue to travel back to it constantly. And this gets slightly spoilery, but they tell you in when episode 2 of the show, and very much at the beginning of the book, that his mother dies, and he continues to travel back to that. And I loved how the show portrayed how he continues to travel back in time to his mother's death. And then also, he was always drawn to traveling back to meet the younger version of his future wife, Claire. And this is where the love story comes in. And it's kind of a weird love story, because it's a little weird, and it can make you a little uncomfortable, because the premise is that Henry, adult Henry, keeps traveling back in time to different points in Claire's childhood, and he can't help. He's not trying to be a creep. He's not trying to groom his future wife into being that. He goes out of his way to not tell her that they're married in the future. He just can't help it. He just always ends up hanging out with her, and they have this little secret spot in the woods that they hang out at. But so he just plays board games with her, plays checkers with her, and just hangs out and tries to be her friend. But she, in the meantime, falls in love with him over time. And she eventually figures out on her own that they're going to get married in the future. He refuses to admit that, because he doesn't want to be a creep. He doesn't want to be like, I'm an older dude who's grooming this young girl to be my wife. He's trying not to. He just can't. He can't help traveling back to her all the time. But she just naturally kind of over time falls in love with him. And this is where it can get really complex and intricate, and both the show and the book do a very good job at conveying it, is that Henry is traveling back at different times of his life, and it's not in chronological order. So Claire is meeting, I think she first meets him when he's 35, and then later she meets him when he's 32, and then later she meets him when he's 40, and then later she meets him when he's 29 or whatever, and it's all out of order for him. So when he first meets her, he goes, "Oh, hey, Claire," and she's like, "Who are you?" And he's like, "Oh, is this the first time we met?" Because it's completely out of order for him. But both the show and the book do a really good job at like making it make sense for the reader or the viewer, if the case, whatever the case may be. Um, and then when she meets him for the first time, he's in his early 20s, and he has yet at that point to travel back in time to her because of whatever is driving him to go back to her doesn't know to do that yet because he hasn't met her yet. So from his perspective, this is a crazy girl that he's never seen before in his life, and she's like, "Oh, Henry! Oh my God, you've been here my whole childhood." Um, and it's an interesting line in the show, and I can't remember if it came from the book, where um, she was like, "Yeah, you were like grooming me. It's creepy." And he was like, "Who's grooming who? Like, I had no idea who you were. And like, you basically groomed me to turn into the man that you knew from your childhood." Like, it's so trippy. It's so, I freaking love this. I love this like head trip that it does. Like, at the very, this is another thing that type 1 time travel does, is the chicken and the egg phenomenon. Like, who started what? Like, that's technically a paradox, but it's the kind of paradox that I love because it makes you think, and it is not a plot hole. Like, it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense. You know what I'm saying? So it's like there's very much this chicken and egg thing that happens a lot all throughout the story. And that, like, this is, to me, is like, I love this shit so much. So that's kind of why I love the time travel aspect of it. Okay, now when it comes to the relationship between Claire and Henry, I've always just felt it's like very realistic that two people would behave this way in this fantastical situation that I just described to you, and that the problems that they have are problems that you would have when one of them like continues to travel back in time, and they met because she traveled back in time when she was a girl. So it's a really trippy story, and but the way that the two characters respond, I feel like, is realistic in the conversations that they have and the issues that they have, the arguments that they have. uh, feel very real to me. Like, it feels like an actual relationship, which I feel like we don't see enough of in shows and films, where it does feel like an actual real relationship. And this one does. And they very, very much deeply love each other, which is also very clear and apparent in both the novel and the show. So that is another reason why I've always loved this. And now with this show, um, the actors that they get, I think, are 50-50. So Henry is played by Theo James, who I guess is also in White Lotus, which I haven't watched yet. How come White Lotus is all of a sudden this big thing everyone's talking about and is in season 2? I never heard of White Lotus season 1. So I don't know. Maybe I'll check it out because I really like this actor. So he, to me, is Henry. Eric Bana played him in the film, and I think he's very good. So Theo James is Henry. He does such an amazing job. Now, on the flip side, you have Claire, who is played by Rose Leslie, who I think most of you would recognize from Game of Thrones as Ygritte. You know nothing, Jon Snow. But here she's playing an American. She's a Scottish actress, so she's doing an American accent. It took me a while to warm up to her. If I'm going to be honest with you, I think a lot of it has to do with I didn't always buy her American accent, and just didn't feel her as Claire at first. I actually think that Rachel McAdams, who played her in the movie, did a much better job at Claire. She feels more like Claire from the book to me, but Rose Leslie did grow on me after a while, particularly in some of the episodes that focus in on Claire in particular. I think she actually does an excellent job. So she's not terrible. She probably wouldn't have been my first choice to play Claire, but she does eventually develop really good chemistry with Theo James. I didn't feel it really strongly at the beginning, but they definitely develop it by the end of the season. So Theo James, excellent. Rose Leslie, good by the end of the season, and it works. She would probably be the only slightly weak point of the show for me, but overall, it still works out really, really well. So I would recommend that you see this show, but since there's only been one season and you're going to have the story cut off halfway through, I would also recommend that you read the novel. The novel is really, really good. So watch the first season, and then, like, if you want to know what actually happens at the second half of the story, you can read the book. So that's what I would recommend. Okay, so I think it's time to wrap this week's video up with my usual rating out of 10. So 1 would be the lowest possible score that I would give. 10 would be the highest possible score. And my rating for The Time Traveler's Wife out of 10 is a 9. I freaking adore this show so much. I wish there was going to be a second season. And Rose Leslie, probably the only reason is this is a 9 instead of a 10. And she's really good by the end of it, and things work out by the end of it. But I was a little shaky with her at the beginning. And I may have a few nitpicks here and there, but this was a very solid 9. Although I will say that you'll find this in my top 10 in a couple weeks. That's one of the videos that I will be doing. And I have a whole bunch of 9s this year. And I think it's kind of on the tail end of all of my 9s. So it's in my top 10. But I think the other 9s that I have rated are probably higher than it. I had to rank all the different shows that I gave a 9 to, but this is one of them. This is a 9 out of 10. Time Traveler's Wife. Watch it. Read the book. All right, so that does it for the most underrated show of 2022 video. Please join me next week where I will be getting negative again and getting into the worst show of 2022. And if you've ever watched my channels, particularly my Star Trek reviews, you already know what the worst show is going to be. I'll do the whole drum roll thing for theatrics, but if you know my channel, you know what it is already. But you don't know my top 10, except for, The Time Traveler's Wife is on there somewhere because I just told you. But that will be in 2 weeks. That will be the day before New Year's Eve, December 30th. You will get my top 10 best shows of 2022. So please subscribe if you have not already, and check out all of my other content. Check out my most overrated video as well. I will see you all really soon. Goodbye.